introduction. So it is my honor and my pleasure on behalf of the African Union Commission to welcome all the participants to this consultative meeting on the Africa Data Policy Framework. It is informal consultation. It is open to all stakeholders. We have posted the invitation in different platforms, and we welcome your participation and your interest in this framework. So this initiative is one of the top priorities of the African Union this year. And this one is considering the growing and also strategic importance of data as valuable asset for the development of today's digital economy and society. The development of this framework is in line with the Specialized Technical Committee on ICT decision of 2019 and also the Executive Council decision of 2020, where these two organs of the African Union mandated or tasked the Commission, the AU Commission, to take the lead and coordinate the development of a comprehensive and forward-looking continental data policy framework and submit the letter for adoption in 2021. So the aim of this framework is to respond to African needs and also Africa context to enable our countries to take advantage of the huge amount of data being generated and also collected daily by the African citizens and industries, and also ensure an efficient and secure use of data to open up new opportunities for African citizens and businesses. So the framework is being developed by a task force. The task force is composed of all African organizations, Pan-African organizations, regional economic communities, IU specialized agencies and institutions, as well as UN specialized agencies dealing with data, namely UNICTAD, ITU, and also some development partners like European Union, World Bank, GSMA, and other organizations, just to name a few of them. So this framework is being developed with financial support of GIZ and technical support from Research ICT Africa, which is the consultancy firm which is helping us in drafting this framework. As you may have noticed, we have posted the first draft with some relevant questions online, and it's open for comments and inputs since 1 week. And today's session aims to have open conversation on the main components and also objectives of this framework, to enable us to hear from different stakeholders and also to reflect your views at early stage before we move to the next steps. So the more elaborated version will be presented to member states for further discussion and also validation in early September, and before taking the document for adoption for consideration by the ministerial meeting in October. And after that, if the document is adopted by the ministerial meeting, it will go to the summit. So the vision of this framework is in line with the goals and aspirations of the Agenda 2063, as well as other strategic frameworks such as the digital transformation strategy that was adopted in 2020, the Smart Africa vision to transform Africa into a single digital market by 2030, the African Continental Free Trade Area, the CFTA, among others frameworks, since data is a cross-cutting and also cross-sector, and we have noticed this yesterday during the Digital ID meeting, where we understood that data and digitalization is affecting all our aspects of our social lives, and we need to adapt our policies, legislations, and regulations to this new era. And the development of this framework is one of the objectives, is to adapt to the digital transformation and also create secure and enabling environment for development of data-enabled economies and society. So the vision of this framework is to develop a continental data policy that unlock the huge transformative power of data to empower African countries and people, safeguard Africa interests, and also protect people digital rights to collectively advance the development and integration objectives of our continent. The main aspects that we aim to address within this framework are related to data governance. We aim to come up with a mechanism and enable and framework to ensure availability and interoperability and also foster cross-border data flows. We aim to address the data economy aspect, which is very important for our development, and to create a common data space and consolidated ecosystem that foster or facilitate intra-Africa digital trade and enable the development of data-enabled economies and also new businesses. We aim to address the part related to digital rights, or where we can find the personal data protection and also the privacy, in order to sustain trust and confidence in Africa digital environment. We aim also to address all aspects related to digital infrastructure to enable our countries to host, process, and self-manage their data in order to reduce the dependency on external providers and also to ensure security of our data. The last component that we want to address is related to data capacity, and objective is to come up with some policy recommendations or actions to address the shortage of data professionals across the continent. This one is just an overview of what we want to address within this framework, but we'll have the opportunity to go through very detailed presentations with the experts from Research ICT Africa, and it will be followed with the open sessions for questions, and we look forward to hear from your comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sahila. Thank you for the opening. So I'll quickly actually pass on in the sense of time to Dr. Alison Gilwald, who's the Director of Research ICT Africa, leading the team that is working on this data policy framework, and also facilitating the work of the task force to write one coherent, qualitative, good document. Alison, over to you.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you very much to Sahila. We may refer to people by first names as we try and work through the process today. I just wanted to confirm that you do see my screen.
Probably I'm still sharing mine.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So, okay, I stopped and I can see yours.
Great.
Alison.
All right. Thank you so much. So firstly, thank you very much to all of you who've joined us, especially at such short notice, and to those of you who've managed to get some really already very interesting inputs onto the online consultation document. I think we'll discuss some of the kind of logistics around that a little later. We have tried to just flag some of the interesting things that have come up. Of course, we're hoping that the people who made those inputs will contribute more during the discussions. And I think, you know, Suhila's already gone through very extensively the rationale and the mandate for this, but I just think in terms of this, it is, you know, important to emphasize, particularly in the context of COVID-19, the pandemics and lockdowns that have really highlighted the, you know, stark problems of digital inequality across the continent. And, you know, really this pandemic that's often been referred to as the first data-driven pandemic, just enormous implications, not only for, you know, enormous economic opportunities that exist if we can get, you know, integrated functioning data systems operating across the country, across the continent, but also for these much, you know, bigger challenges that face us in many ways around structural inequality and well-being. So the mandate from this, obviously, as Suhail has mentioned, comes very much from the African Union's digital transformation strategy that you know, is really the grounding or the main digital transformation background for the rest of the framework. Sorry, this thing is jumping around apparently without my attention. So just to say that the policy framework in terms of the mandate is really very clear that it is a data policy framework, and as such it is not it's not data policy, it's not a model law, it doesn't create obligations or constraints on members, it doesn't provide any legislative template for domestication, but it is providing guidance on the essential harmonization that we do need if we're going to build single markets, if we're going to get economic growth, and if we're going to get sustainable development. And it is, the purpose of it is to encourage domestication of these broad principles at the national level so that we can meet those objectives. The other thing I just wanted to mention before we get into the detail is the scope of the data policy framework. I think if we look, we've got an extensive mapping of legal and policy, data policy frameworks, data policy law, across data law across various jurisdictions. And of course, this has been led, as it usually is or often is, by the jurisdictions in the global north, and generally has focused on data protection. There are broad regional data policies, and they're very useful to look at, and we can learn a lot from them. But in terms of the data law, it's mainly focused on data protection, and within that kind of context, it's really focused very much on privacy and very individualistic notions of privacy, and therefore very kind of individualistic solutions. And we really want to, we're required to expand that scope, both for the data protection, but also to understand data more widely. So when we talk about data governance, we go beyond just personal data, and we're dealing with a plethora of data-related issues that you'll see. It's actually difficult to kind of circumscribe the scope because it now is so cross-cutting across every area of life and work. But really, what we're doing is, with these issues, you'll see later in the presentation that we're looking at, the movement of data, the control of data, competition issues related to data, quality, the integrity of data, all of these things that are, additional to issues of data protection and are equally important, but different from issues of data protection, which can be thought of rather as a function of data governance, because it focuses on one aspect of data governance, and that's basically the personal data, personal information. And of course, this is a very important right, the right of privacy, to build public trust in data systems, but there are also other rights that also need to be highlighted, and we want to focus on those too. So the purpose of the framework is really, is envisaged to serve several closely related purposes, including enabling states to cooperate on matters of data governance, to achieve common objectives and sustainable development, informing and supporting the domestication of continental policy by countries, and enabling states, the private sector, civil society, and intergovernmental organizations, including the RECs, to coordinate their efforts on data issues on the continent. And of course, the important imperative of recognizing the single digital market and competing more effectively in this very globalized environment. So the broad guiding principles of the framework, as opposed to the principles of the data regulation, is that for member states, it's about cooperating to exchange data, acknowledging that data is the central input of a global economy and is essential to a flourishing African market. The data policy shall enable an environment that encourages investment and innovation and human development. It shall provide certainty based on the locus of control of data under different circumstances, and I'll speak a little bit more about different kinds of data and how this requires different governance and has different values associated with it. Data policy shall harmonize data regulation through the domestication of law within the national scope offered by the framework. And the data sovereignty is obviously an important principle that we recognize in creating a common framework for the continent. So that was really the principles that should be guiding member states in thinking about this document or applying this document. And then we've got principles for the data systems, which should be trustworthy. And we're referring here, there's a lot of issues around trust that we were struggling in yesterday's digital ID session. And it's a struggle for this too. The ideas that you create trust simply through technical measures of security and safety and really don't necessarily deliver trust. In fact, it's the trust is about the issues that you can't just apply those technical solutions to, and it really raises what additional things have to be in place in order for people to trust systems, to trust political systems, to trust economic systems and social systems. But we'll get back to that hopefully in our discussions. Data systems should be equitable. They should address structural inequalities and offer opportunities and benefits to all. This is a really big challenge for us because the global data systems so stacked us against us, but I think we really have to examine in what ways we can create more equitable systems, both internally within countries, but also between countries as well. The system needs to be safe and secure. When we said it doesn't necessarily deliver trust, this is a necessary condition before we'll even get trust. Data systems, whether public or private, should be designed to operationalize and to be operationalized for ethical treatment of data from the point of source to the end user. And this has often been referred, and I think in the ID document, there was some discussion of that concept of privacy by design. From the point of the actual data, codes of data ethics should be created by those affected by them, and data shouldn't be used to discriminate unfairly. And there are also obviously more active ways in which one can ensure that the data sets are less biased, or all people are more visible in them, that are more representative, and that they're not used in such a way that results in discrimination. I am really sorry, I'm not even touching this and it seems to be going on. I feel like somebody else has control. Maybe I'm meant to be moving on faster. Let me do that. So just, some of the questions that we did ask really relate to some of these high-level principles. If there are things that really don't seem right or things that really seem missing, it would be really good to get your feedback on that. We really are looking forward to receiving more on that. And then the next thing I just really wanted to touch on, I'm really touching on some of the backgrounding documents, so the backgrounding thinking before we get to the actual framework and the data framework, the economic regulation components of it, the data governance components. But broadly, we've assumed that the framework needs to be informed by international law, and that seeks to inform data policies which respect and fulfill human rights. We also have emphasized that while human rights obviously are critical and important, these first generation rights also need to be considered in the context of also realizing second and third generation social and economic rights as well. In this sense, we're guided very much by the Malabo Convention, which acknowledges international law, and continental law as well, African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection. And we just raised the issue of equity, that with the framework will, there's a pursuit of equitable and just outcomes required by the extension of first generation political rights, notably equality, to recognize social and economic rights as well. But I think the important thing with speaking about equity is also in relation to the concept of inclusion. So of course, this framework, we want it to be as inclusive as possible, but I think we've seen with, in other policy work that inclusion is not sufficient. Inclusion does not necessarily give you equity. Simply having people connected, but they can't actually use their connections meaningfully or optimize them for their well-being is inadequate. So inclusion is a necessary condition again, but it's not a sufficient condition. And then I've spoken to the challenges around trust. And then we just wanted to highlight some of the issues around trust and ethics. that, you know, a lot of the emphasis on ethics at the moment, both within industries, but also within, you know, multilateral organizations, and people concerned with, you know, good data, good ID, good AI, is that in many of these contexts, ethics kind of supplant the trust right, the trust framing that you need. So ethics are good, ethics are important, but they're certainly not a substitute for you know, the rights that need to safeguard citizens and enable citizens to exercise their rights and enjoy some of the benefits of these services. And then, as I said, you know, the concept of data sovereignty, obviously within the context of the framework, is recognized. It's, you know, nation states have democratic prerogatives as states to do certain things. There are different approaches, though, in different parts of the world, and we do see that, you know, on the issue of data sovereignty, some states are more comfortable with this being private sector led, and very often these private sector led ones are you know, global companies who dominate in this area anyway, and then you tend to get some that are more state led, and of course, you know, the kind of most extremes, you would have the US and China on the other hand, but, you know, Russia, many other countries. So I'm going to leave this for our end discussion, but we did have some, you know, some really interesting inputs already on some of these core issues, these fundamental issues. And I'm just going to read one here, and perhaps the person who's written it can speak to it, and Kito, you can just point out who that is. So trust is central to a robust, flourishing data environment that helps that helps transparently mobilize resources, ensure equitable service delivery, honest, open, and enhanced interaction between government, civil society, fair legal structures, impartial institutions, and a lack of impunity. So we'll come back to some of these issues. Was also special mention made of the importance of children's rights in relation to data, and that's an important one for us to consider as well. So just very quickly, some of the policy considerations, the policy challenges, the policy issues that inform us as we prepared the framework is...
Toutes les conditions qui vont informer le cadre.
Sorry, is that a question?
I think someone turned on their mic, or it was French in the interpretation, but yeah. Please continue.
For me to move on, but I have to move on anyway. So let me do that. So the policy considerations are that we want to, you know, we have to identify the preconditions for optimization of public and commercial value of data, of optimizing the commercial and public value. A lot is made in a lot of the multilateral organizations, in a lot of the banks, about the incredible opportunity that data provides. And you know, until some of these preconditions are met, infrastructural, human development, institutional, regulatory, until these preconditions are met, we simply not, you know, we can't address this next layer, and we certainly can't address it in a way that is equitable. So the preconditions, or we do harp on them, but they are just absolutely critical for us. What we do need to consider is, how do we create conditions for investment, fair competition, and innovation, while, you know, prioritizing issues of equity and inclusion and justice. And then, you know, what are the mechanisms by which we redress the uneven distribution of opportunities and harms that are associated with data access and value creation? So even when you get inclusion, there may still be, you know, a very uneven distribution of the opportunities for people, you know, passively, you know, they're only data subjects, or they're not even informed data subjects. And then, of course, the harms associated with that are also, you know, very, the impacts of these harms are different on different people, and we need differential risk mitigation to deal with that. I've mentioned the other issues about rights. We really understand by, you know, meshing the data protection component, the data governance component, the data protection component, which has really mainly been only about negative regulation, that is, you know, regulation, compliance regulation, you know, don't breach privacy, that kind of regulation, with, you know, developing some positive policy interventions, particularly for issues of redress and around economic regulation. And so bringing these together, we think really, creates a viable framework for, growth, sustainable development, and recognizing some of the equity issues as well. We feel it's important, while recognizing the importance of privacy and of data protection, that issues of collective and public interest need to be considered. I think we've, the problems with COVID-19 have highlighted the importance of really finding robust frameworks of protecting privacy, but not prioritizing individual privacy, above the need for collective or public interest use of data. And they're not incompatible. We need to find ways that they can work together. And then the globalized nature of the data ecosystem and the digital ecosystem requires global collaboration and active participation in global governance. And, I think we see with all, with cyber law, we see with data protection, we see very much that these are, that Africa's are, standard takers. The standard setters are generally in the global north. And, then the standards are not necessarily set to meet the needs of the African continent, or people on the African continent. So there's obviously universal things that we can draw from that. They're very important things that have to be coordinated at an international level in terms of standards and protocols for things to work. But we need to be more engaged in those systems to ensure that our interests are reflected. And I think this kind of a broader approach to the data framework really allows us to tap into these global digital taxes, that we could actually get proper revenues from platforms that are generating incomes in our continent and that sort of thing. So there's very much a need for global governance, and also for realizing these global public goods and at the national level. That we need the cooperation and collaboration for that. So our approach is ecosystemic. We're looking at the data ecosystem very much within the broader digital ecosystem, and I'll just speak to that in a minute. But our approach is that we identify the policy challenge, we identify the principles to guide actions or interventions required. We try and identify the institutional arrangements, and then go to the potential strategies and mechanisms and instruments, but that would go towards implementation. And so that's the kind of point at which we stop. Just to say a word about the institutional arrangements, because it comes up in various of the other sections, and there's already a lot being dealt with in those sections, is when we talk about these institutional arrangements, we're talking about the interplay between the state, between the market, or the state and its dedicated agencies, so the delegated authorities that are specialized agencies to deal with some of this complexity that we're speaking about, the market, and then of course the consumers and citizens. So the imperative, the importance of this is is to coordinate state and private sector delivery of increasingly private sector delivery of some of these public goods, or social goods or merit goods, and to uphold the rights of citizens, whether they residents, refugees, to uphold the rights of people who the data is being used, or who are affected by the data, automated data decisions, enable fair competition, efficient resource allocation. And here we think it's really important that we understand supply side valuation of these resources, demand side valuation of the resources, not only the commercial supply side valuation that has informed this work that this framing that we've seen elsewhere in the world. And then of course, the purpose of this all across the world, improved competition, etc., is to improve consumer welfare. And then this also raises the important point, because data is so cross-cutting and has so many dimensions to it, the issues of co-jurisdiction and coordination between different regulators is really important. So
I'm sorry, I need to flag that you're already over your time.
Okay, let me finish up with this. Let me just finish up with this slide, and then I'll have to ask somebody else to pick up some of the nature of data and value of data, because I think that's an important part of the discussion. But just to say, this is the kind of adaptive systems that we are, complex adaptive ecosystem that we're talking about. And that we, need the coordination of these different elements, if things are going to work. We've got these, intensifying processes of digitalization and datification that, if we want to direct towards development and towards innovation, really require that we get the correct governance frameworks in place, that we engage at the international level, at the regional level, and of course at the national level, deal with several of those preconditions that we spoke about. And so just to end off, then I just want to say that they're important in our approach is that the nature of data is acknowledges that there are very many different kinds of data, and that in that sense it's really the this non-rivalrous properties of data that allow it to be infinitely used, and that distinguish it from the scarce resources such as oil, and that permits the varied forms of value creation that we see. So I think, if we look at some of the other data, there's very often it speaks about, data value as a single thing. And I think, we need to really think about it, that from a policy point of view, we need to think about it, that it can, be understood as this non-rivalrous product. The nature of it is so non-rivalrous that it has the potential for significant policy gains in its application. So it can be understood as an infrastructural resource, and we know the associated multipliers that relate to infrastructure investments, and of course then the necessary regulation of infrastructural resources as public goods. And as I mentioned, the importance there of not only looking at this from a supply side point of view, from a commercial point of view, but also from a public value point of view. The other side of this, of course, is that the value creation mechanisms of data analytics for knowledge creation and automated decision making through artificial and machine learning also are very important areas of value creation.
I think we need to move on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, that's fine. I'm going to have to end there. I just, if in the discussions when we pick it up, we can just try and explore a little bit further what the difference between public goods and public value, and also the importance of building into the framework the mechanisms to realize public value, in addition, of course, to commercial value and innovation. Thanks very much. Sorry for running over, Johannes.
Thank you, Addison. Yeah, I think it's a really broad topic, and I think this is also one of the challenges we are facing. We're trying to master. So I try to not to take too much time. I think, Addison, you have to stop sharing your screen so that Shamira can start sharing hers. Shamira Ahmed is the researcher who will present on the topic of economic regulation. Do you have your presentation ready?
Hi, yes, Johannes. I'm just trying to share my screen. Hello, everybody.
Wonderful. So for everyone who has joined in the meantime, we will just have a couple of presentations, and after Shamira's presentation, now we'll move on for the first part of the discussion. There is also interpretation in French available, and please stay muted during the time of the presentation. We will take questions after this presentation then. Shamira, the floor is yours. Thank you. We can see your screen, or at least I can.
We can, yes.
Okay, I'm just trying to put it in presentation mode. There's like a tab here.
I think it's the button next to share.
Yeah, there's the tab there. Okay. I think that's better. Can you see my screen?
Not anymore, actually.
It actually stopped, yeah.
It's gone.
Okay, so let me take it out of presentation mode then. And now?
No, I think you have to click on the share screen button again.
Sorry, everybody. Okay.
Okay.
Mira, it's fine like that if it's not.
Perfect. Now it's perfect.
Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes, we can.
So I will be picking up from Alison's introduction on the data policy framework, and I'll be capturing the economic regulation aspects of our approach to the data policy framework. Just a quick overview, I will start with the aim and scope of economic regulation. I will discuss the main components, which are based on understanding and valuing data, digital economy preconditions, the data ecosystem, and I will end off with principles and recommendation areas. In terms of the aim and scope for economic regulation, the main aims are: one, to reaffirm the importance of the African Union's commitment to stable, harmonized, and predictable regulatory frameworks and contextually relevant policies. And these are important to facilitate incentives for efficient investment in foundational digital data infrastructure, foundational digital systems, build human and institutional digital capability, and to ultimately create value from responsible data use that can foster sustainable, equitable growth and enhance shared prosperity from the data economy. Another aim and scope of the economic regulation is to set the comprehensive framework for facilitating collaboration, delivering enhanced solidarity amongst the elements in the data ecosystem. And just to remind everyone, the data ecosystem is the diagram that Alison showed in one of her previous slides. So that ecosystem has government, regulators, private sector, international stakeholders, and it highlights that greater coherence is needed in an increasingly complex dynamic ecosystem with interlinked policy contexts. And lastly, the aim and scope for economic regulation will be to set out the characteristics of a successful forward-looking framework for economic regulation to guide policymakers in assessing risks, challenges, and opportunities that will impact future developments in the data ecosystem. Okay, my slide is stuck, okay. And then in terms of the framework, summarize the economic framework in terms of understanding and valuing data, the digital economy preconditions, and the data ecosystem. In terms of understanding and valuing data, we have conceptualized data as a factor of production, where we consider the public versus private valuation mechanisms, market versus non-market valuation, capabilities for value creation, characteristics of data that impact value attribution, and current data ecosystem endowments and enablers. And this is just adding on to some of the factors that Alison touched on. In terms of data ecosystems, it will be based on an enabling policy and regulatory framework between different mechanisms that states can use: competition, taxation, trade, digital entrepreneurship, research and innovation, global governance, and industry norms, and how a coherent approach between all these different sectors actually enhances the data ecosystem. And the enablers or preconditions will be capabilities of users and providers, and the government, interoperability of cross-border digital infrastructure and systems, and physical digital infrastructure, including electricity, and foundational digital systems, which include digital ID, open payment systems, and interoperability. And then in terms of understanding and valuing data, we have economic and informational definitions of data. In economic terms, data is non-rivalrous, it's an intangible asset, has variable returns, and has externalities, amongst others. In terms of informational characteristics, type, generability, quality, interoperability, and temporal coverage, or time actually impact the value assigned to it. And we also highlight that accumulation of data alone has little or no economic value and actually requires complementary investments. and activities to create a virtuous data cycle. And assigning value to data, as Alison mentioned, is quite complex and subjective. There are private tensions and private rationale on how value is assigned, and public dimensions on how public data value is assigned as well. So it is quite complex and subjective and depends on a lot of other factors. And lastly, big data characteristics, volume, veracity, and variety make data evaluation more complex. And also automation, such as AI and machine learning in the data value cycle, can also enhance quality and value attributed or extracted from data. And in terms of the digital economy preconditions to facilitate dividends, digital technologies can exacerbate digital divides or enhance shared dividends. But the dividends that you gain are dependent on spreading the benefits and reducing risks, and you can spread the benefits through inclusion, efficiency, and innovation. You can reduce risks through regulatory and policy frameworks that reduce control, inequality, and market concentration. And in order to achieve the dividends, you need to have a digital development strategy that enhances connectivity and that makes the internet accessible, affordable, open, and safe, and complements spreading the benefits and reducing risks. In terms of the data ecosystem, which was a figure that Alison showed, and has data subjects or citizens at the center. It's based on a complex adaptive system where collaborative, harmonized, dynamic policy and regulatory frameworks are necessary to shape the deployment of new technologies and create an enabling environment for digital information, market development, and ethical user being. And this will be done by enhancing use, access, capabilities to facilitate value creation from data as a factor of production for private and public interests. And this will be done through coherent trade, competition, taxation, and innovation instruments, amongst others, by enabling the strategic use of data for productive, inclusive, and trustworthy governance, and equitable distribution of digital dividends, which can be monetary or otherwise, from using data as a factor of production, and facilitating inclusive and responsible use of data guided by appropriate industry technical and regulatory norms, standards, and best practices that underpin both the informational and economic strategies, economic characteristics, of data in priority industries, as identified in the digital transformation strategy, establishing safe and responsible data sharing frameworks that facilitate data interoperability, cross-border data flows, systems, and open data standards within key priority sectors as assigned by the DTS, and inclusive forward-looking approach to human capital and institutional capacity investments, which are required to develop requisite digital capabilities that can contribute to data value creation for various data value cycles and ultimately contribute to data-driven innovation and digital entrepreneurship. The main principles of the economic regulation are based on a comprehensive framework. It's going to be contextually relevant and fit for purpose, experimental and dynamic, equitable and inclusive, transparent, citizen-centric, and sustainable. Our key recommendation areas include dynamic policy and regulatory reform and experimentation, for example, through regulatory sandboxes at industry and reg level, policy coherence, partnerships, and strategic coordination across different mandates for supporting environments that enhance a culture of digital entrepreneurship and fair, inclusive data markets, fostering collaboration and solidarity among stakeholders, and leveraging existing partnerships and institutions in order to navigate the emergence of new dynamic data-driven business models and foster intra-African digital trade and data-enabled entrepreneurship. And the most important thing is that there needs to be a way to address structural and multidimensional digital access and use barriers and economic deficits that limit the potential for Africans to leverage data value creation. And lastly, there needs to be a coordinated, comprehensive, harmonized regional approach to global governance challenges that are associated with the data economy, which include competition issues of big tech multinationals, tax issues in the OECD BEPS process, for example, data and AI governance issues that emerge from techno-nationalist economies, cybersecurity issues, trade and e-commerce issues, and just to name a few. And our key questions in terms of economic regulation are what interventions would help unlock the value of data, what structural economic deficits need to be addressed as they may hinder many African countries' ability to leverage the positive effects associated with the emerging data economy, and what innovative data policy reforms in trade, competition, tax, innovation, infrastructure investments, etc., are required to enable the design of a progressive data ecosystem that creates a fair distribution of value from data for Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamira. That was faster than expected, which is great, because then that will help us to get back on time. All right, so now is the time to actually raise your hands and kick off the discussion. We have 40 minutes allocated for the first discussions. We are 9 minutes behind the schedule, but since I definitely don't want a discussion, I'll try to move everything slightly later and give you the chance to raise your points. I just saw that 2 longer comments have been posted in the chat. I would kindly request you, in order to have a discussion and also really understand your input, to raise your hand and open your mic, so that we can have a conversation and speak to each other. So I'm not sure, Halle from Abraha, if you would like to comment on the Malabo Convention here, or anything you think it should be part of the data policy framework, or if anybody else would like to raise their hands.
Johannes, just while people think about that, can I just comment on Halefom's comment? He's not.
If you already had the chance to read through it, sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, I think it's it's kind of incontestable in many ways. But I think the fact that I think in the discussion there's already been mention made that we only have we don't have enough countries having ratified, whatever the number is. There seems to be some confusion about that, but we haven't been able to get enough countries to ratify it in order to bring it into force. So this is obviously a serious challenge. I think just to make the point that I think all the points about we tried to squash too much into one convention. That's probably a lot of truth. There's a lot of intersections and complementarity with cybercrime and data protection things. So they often are addressed in parallel legislation or close together. But I agree that there's a lot in there and that possibly made more opportunity for lack of consensus around certain of those things. But I think if one looks at the goals of the Malabo Convention and the kind of principles, those have not changed that much. What has changed is that kind of environment. And it's a point I just really wanted to raise in the beginning that I think I didn't get to, was I think it's really important with this framework and with other law, and it would be really nice to get people's input on that, is the framework really wants to deal with quite high level principles. And even when it's domesticated, if it is domesticated into law, one wants to be careful to keep that quite high level, because this environment is so fast changing. that if you don't, your law very rapidly comes out of date. So if you can get the principles all in place, which aren't that fast moving, and then actually have, delegated powers, your regulated law, or your delegated law, your regulators actually dealing with the, having greater flexibility than the law. I think we saw in Mexico, where they actually put a number of these digital imperatives into the constitution several years ago, and it's actually really, although they were intended very positively and to create digital inclusion and all sorts of things, they've really hamstrung regulators and the market in responding to certain things. So from a principled response, I would just say, all the points that you make are there. The important thing is that we really focus on those principles and keep the flexibility that we need in the regulation. That's where it should be, so that we've got that flexibility. But that was just a response to, I think, a very useful comment that Halafon made.
Thank you for responding to that, Alison. We do have a first hand up. Very happy about that. So I would ask Leandri to open her mic and please step forward and be as concise as possible in formulating your question. And feel free to also quickly introduce yourself. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I hope you are seeing my face. And I will thank everyone for the very good presentations. It was very interesting, and also about what Alison just said. I'm Leandri from UN Habitat in Nairobi. And I'm really happy to see that this kind of discussion is ongoing about this critical question of data, especially in the African context, because at UN Habitat we are also focusing on this topic, but especially on the cities level. And as a kind of framework is developing, it's very interesting to see what we come up from that. And also, I really want, as Alison said, to see, it's very important based on this framework to see how we can translate it to actual policies at the policies, legislation, and law at the local and the national, and also at the local level. And when I say local level, I'm thinking about cities level, to see how data, citizen the right of citizen can be protected, and also because this aspect of digital inclusion also from data, digital inclusion in the context of Africa, and also the aspect of digital right also are very important. Based on this framework, I'm looking forward to see how from the result of the framework we can translate it in actual policy that will protect that digital right and promote digital and inclusion of city. But also, as we said earlier, the importance of the high level of this framework, that this framework should be translated at the top from the top of the government, because also in Africa there is these challenges of sometimes there are policy but they are not applicated on the field. So we have to very work on that aspect of the implementation, and also to see how to liberalize this question of data, of policy to the simple African people. They have to understand what is going on from on the topic, and how their data are used. It's also very important to liberalize the language among this regulation, this data, this aspect. Is what I have to share. And also based from UN Habitat, we are also working on what we call the digital help desk. It's a kind of task force that will help cities to deal with this aspect of data in terms of policy, in terms of concrete action project, etc. So it's very, very interesting. I'm very looking forward to see what will come up from this discussion and this framework. And very happy to be here. I will do my best to stay to the end because it's very interesting. So thank you so much.
Thank you there, Andre. Thank you for sharing. So we have no other raised hands, also no comments at this point. I'm not sure if Alison or Shamira, you would like to respond. I see that Suhila has been raising her hand. Suhila, would you like to respond to this?
Yes, thank you. I just want to come back to the question on the Malabo Convention and also say some words about the last comments from the representative of the UN Habitat from Nairobi. So with regard to the Malabo Convention, as it was posted on the chat, unfortunately, the Malabo is not yet, didn't yet enter into force because we need 15 ratifications. And so far we reached 10 because I see the comment they say on the website we have only 8. The reason is just because the countries, they didn't yet submit the instrument of ratification formally to the African Union Commission to enable us to put it on the website, because we heard that some additional countries have ratified the Malabo Convention, namely Zambia and Morocco, and others, they are about to finalize this process. But for us, we cannot announce them if we, unless we receive formally the instrument of ratification. And on the question saying that the Malabo Conventions now is the challenges surrounding this ratification, I agree somehow with the comments posted on the chat, because it is the reality. But we need also, as Alison mentioned, it's not, we cannot say that it is a failure, because it is an instrument that has been discussed by all 55 countries through the across the continent. It embodies some common principles for the development of digital environment in Africa, on personal data, on cybersecurity, on cybercrime, and on e-commerce. And the principles are being implemented and taken into account at regional level and also at national levels, because even countries, they didn't yet ratify the Malabo Convention, but when they drafted their national legislations or regulations, they take into account the principles and the objectives and the main components of the Malabo Convention. And also there is discussion, actually there is a discussion within the African Union Commission about the possibility to review this convention, but it is not yet formal. It is internal discussion at this level, but it is worth informing the participants that there is discussion about the possibility of updating or coming with additional model laws to support the different components of this Malabo Convention to better respond to the needs of today, because digitalization is a reality. And also Africa, we need to really speed up the development of the legal and regulatory frameworks for this. When it comes to the comment from the representative of the UN Habitat, we welcome very much his participation and the comments, because it is the aim of this informal consultation. As we mentioned, it is open for all organization participants, and all the views, they are welcome. We are at early stage of this developing this framework, and as it was mentioned, we aim to address data from a wide perspective, not only focus on personal data, which is somehow taken into account in the Malabo Convention from the legislative part, but we want to address data as an asset that will facilitate the development of digital economy and also facilitate the integration of the continent. And it is why we have seen that we have presented the part related to the economy, but after that we presented related to data governance, because the aim is really to make efficient use of data in order to respond to our development challenges and also enable our countries to take advantage of this digitalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suhila. I actually think that there is a follow-on question to you. So it seems like the chat is preferred so far to express questions. So the question here to Suhila is, to what extent are legislators, not just ministerial representatives, actively involved in the discussion of these frameworks? Could it be argued that some delay in ratification of the Malabo is because of the legislative arms? I'm not sure, Sohila, if you can speak to that. I'm actually also not quite sure what other legislators than ministerial representatives are meant. Maybe parliamentarians. I'm not sure. But Ilya, Yusuf, would you like to actually come in and expand your question, if your microphone allows? Thank you.
Thank you, but I did mean parliamentarians. Thank you.
Okay, so Hilak, do you want to respond to
Okay,
that?
thank you, Badria, for this question. I think when we talk about legislators, for us as African Union, we talk about member states. Legislators, they are represented at national level, because when we talk about the ratification of the convention, it is discussed at different levels at national level, because the legislators, they may give advice to the parliament, and the process is different from one country to another. From our side, when during the process of development of this convention, it was discussed both by the ministerial meeting of ICT and also the ministerial meeting of justice, because it was adopted by both ministerial meetings before it went to the summit. And now for us as a organization, when we address member state, we address like the country, and after that we suppose that within the country there is cooperation and also collaboration to involve like the concerned parties, because for example, if we share a document related to data with the member states, we expect them to coordinate internally with all parties dealing with data and come up with their comment or their position as a member state. It is the way we work, but through this kind of informal consultation, we open up to other stakeholders. But as I mentioned, this document will be shared with countries, and they will have the opportunity also to review them. And when it comes to the Malabo Convention, I think there is maybe we need a dedicated discussion on this to see really what are the real challenges. And I think and involve really the actors that may speed up this ratification process, namely the parliamentarians and the legislators, and also the foreign affairs, because they are an important part of this process. I hope I addressed your question. Otherwise, feel free to ask any question you may wish to ask, or to comment on what has been presented to you by the experts. As we mentioned, this one is the first draft. We are in the process of collecting inputs and views in order to improve this document, and also to try to take the different views into account. Thank you.
Okay. Alison, you have raised your hand. Do you want to respond to any particular point?
Yeah, as I said, I think we're just here to listen, but I just wanted to say, in response to Leandre's point from UN Habitat, the important point he made, and we actually haven't drawn it out in the draft document so far, and it would be important to do, is the important role of cities that cities can play. And I think what we've seen in sort of many jurisdictions where there might be a national lag, or even a national kind of reluctance to open data, for example. We've got cities, especially some of these kind of mega cities, bigger cities, who've opened up their data in acknowledgement of the role it can play in entrepreneurialism, and getting the data used for startups. So Cape Town City, for example, just where I'm sitting right now, several years ago, as part of their African Silicon Valley concept, their digital hubs here that they've been trying to develop, opened up government data, provincial city data for that kind of use. So I think it's really important that when we speak about the different levels, we actually include city level, especially where city governments have a level of independence to do that kind of thing. The only problem with that, of course, is that it tends to happen in these mega cities. It tends to happen in the cities where there are resources, whereas you really want to enable this, in villages, in all sorts of places where that data could be used, and it's important for planning and that kind of thing. So obviously this is all incremental, but that really does seem to be a place that you could, you could leverage data for these kind of positive effects.
Thank you, Alison. So there's one question on the chat I will read it out since Abraha indicated that it's not in a good position to talk. So given the fact that the vast majority of data about citizens/residents of Africa today is stored, managed, and processed by foreign companies, and I think this means foreign of Africa as a continent, do you think that data localization is a proper policy response for Africa? Alison has mentioned that digital sovereignty is one of the components of the data framework. Could you please discuss what does this mean from the African perspective and how it can be realized? Spoiler alert, I think this is going to be part of the data governance discussion we will have after the break. However, Alison, or I think actually also for the first part, Sahila, I think this question, yeah, do you want to respond to this question?
I'm not sure if Sahila's going to respond. Johannes, just to say, yes, absolutely, we are going into data sovereignty and data localization in the next section. So I'm absolutely no problem to discuss now, but we'll get into the detail there. I'll ask other members of the team too, who haven't necessarily presented now. But you know, part of the challenge of redressing these kind of very uneven, you know, data flows that we have and data value creation requires enabling data to be processed and for value to be created internally. So while we recognize the importance of, you know, of digital sovereignty, and I think it's, you know, inherent in the AUC process, national sovereignty anyway, it's important to apply it in a way that is not just protectionist and actually enhances opportunities. So there's, you know, there's potential in using your local, you know, your national data to as leverage to get certain things out of other, you know, bigger organizations that might want that data, or you can collaborate on that data. So you know, there are multiple aspects to this, and absolutely it's part of kind of, you know, redressing some of these global imbalances and the you know, the concentration and the unfair competition that we have in these areas. But it's, you know, it has to be not kind of knee-jerk. It has to be just not protectionist. It has to actually be enabling. It has to, you have to do that, and you know, may have complementary investments in local business and in, you know, local human development and those kind of things, because value in, you know, data has no value in and of itself. It has to be processed. It has to be, you know, value has to be added to it for it to become useful and valuable. But I'm sure, as I said, we will be going into it, and I see Gabriella's got her hand up just to, and of course Tapiwa would have a lot to say on this too. So let me just end there.
Yeah, Gabi, do you want to go first, and then we hand it to Tapiwa?
I'm also happy to hand it to Tapiwa. I was just going to flag some of the things that I've flagged in our recommendation, well, our early sections on this, but I'm happy to hear external perspectives first. Okay,
Tapiwa, then this is the chance for you.
Thank you very much. Not really external, semi-internal. I was just wondering if the framework will include possibly a more strong development perspective in as far as data is concerned. For example, the creation or development of data value chains in Africa, which is quite critical to the aspect that my colleague Sohila indicated, which has to do with development in Africa, and which also speaks to the data transformation strategy in Africa, as well as the Agenda 2063. So I was just wondering if that aspect of data value chains in Africa is going to be covered. That is the creation of the data collection or extraction to data storage, warehousing, data processing, as well as data analysis. Since, you know, we are, I would want to think, exporting quite a number of talented individuals outside these people can actually add value in as far as, you know, these data value chains, and these data value chains will definitely contribute to the regional value chains as well as the African Continental Free Trade Area. I'm coming from an economist perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapira. So,
Johannes,
am I correct? Sorry, because I asked everyone to just introduce themselves. Am I correct that you are working at AUC?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Just for transparency reasons, Alison, sorry.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say that I think Shamira might want to just comment on Tapiwa's comment.
Yeah, I think Sahila has already unmuted herself. She might also come in first. Thank you.
Okay, so I come first before Shamira. Okay, I just wanted to thank my colleague Tapiwa from the Department of Economic Affairs and Trade for his participation in this meeting, and also for the relevant comment, and for highlighting that really one of the focuses of this framework is the data economy, is how to really use data to support our development and agenda, and also to facilitate the online cross-border online activities between countries. And it is one of the aspects really that we want to address within this framework. Well, when it comes to the data sovereignty, the question says, what is Africa perspective on data sovereignty? I think this one, it's an opportunity through this framework that will come up with Africa's perspective on data sovereignty, because it was not discussed really before this date, but from us it's part that will be addressed within the framework. It will be discussed through the members of the task force. As I mentioned earlier, that the framework is being developed by a task force composed of all the Pan-African organizations and institutions, and also even the regional economic communities that are part of it. And after that, the framework will be submitted to member states for review and further discussion. So I think by at the end of this we'll come up with like this perspective on Africa, on the continent, on this data sovereignty. But what I know that we are trying to really boost the development of the data centers across the continent, and we have through the PDAP project, which is a program for infrastructure development in Africa, which is being implemented by 4 African organizations. There is a really support for the development of regional and continental data centers. We promote the development of digital infrastructure to enable our African countries to host, to process, and also to own their data, because so far we don't own our data. Only 1 or 2% of our data is hosted within the continent. I think we cannot build a digital economy without having digital infrastructure, but I think we'll come up with adequate recommendations within this framework. But it is open discussion. We are just at the beginning, and I hope by the end of this development of this process, we will come up with clear views on Africa perspective on the different aspects. Thank you.
Thank you, Celia. Sorry, I didn't want to go over Shamira. I just had the impression that the question was directed towards Celia. So, Shamira, would you like to add to this?
Yes, Tapira, thank you for your question. And yes, definitely the policy does consider data value creation, because we consider data as a value of production. And in terms of considering it as a value of production, we also have to consider the current digital economic preconditions and what you need to actually have a data ecosystem that creates value from data. So we are considering all those things, the enabling and regulatory frameworks to enhance the data ecosystem at a regional level, which includes competition, taxation, trade, digital entrepreneurship, research and innovation, and the digital economic preconditions, which includes the current realities of the deficits we have, like you mentioned, brain drain that we currently have. We have the capabilities of users and providers and the government to create value from data, and interoperability of cross-border digital infrastructure and systems, which include data processing centers, and also foundational digital systems such as open data systems, digital ID, for instance. So we are considering all those elements of the data value cycle and data value chains.
Thank you so much. There's another question. I just quickly point out that since I don't see many raised hands, I just read this question and then probably head into our 10-minute break as initially planned, before we proceed to the topic of the data governance. There's one question here from Annette. Oh, sorry, actually, this is a direct message. I'm sorry. So that actually means I don't see any new questions on the chat, neither a raised hand. If it stays like this for
Johannes, sorry,
yes.
me again. There do seem to be quite a few questions about kind of awareness raising, training of parliamentarians, and I think these are really, these have been barriers and challenges for us. And I think often when we speak about capacity building and institutional capacity building, we often are speaking about digital capacity, digital institutions. So I think it's a really interesting question. I flag that we are working with, and the SADC Parliamentary Forum is in fact developing a digital model law that will also be drawing in and feeding into this process. And I think because of the important aspects of this from an oversight point of view, once it starts getting domesticated into legislation, it's really important to think about how one might have, alongside this, because we don't have time to have it before, unfortunately, as people have suggested, and afterwards might be sort of late, but to kind of have professional development and specialized development in these areas, for parliamentary committees who are looking at digitalization or ICTs or multiple committees, economic committees, etc. So I just flagged it's an interesting discussion that's been there.
Yeah, I didn't actually pick that one because I didn't interpret it as a question, and I was trying to focus on the framework in terms of a regulatory piece of work, so to say. Of course, there's much more has to be done around it. However, I think I would now invite everyone for a quick coffee break. Feel free to have a chat in the chat and join us back here in about 10 minutes, I think. Yes. Also, welcome to everyone who has just joined us. We are about to start the second part of the open consultation, the informal open consultation on the data policy framework. We will be looking at the data governance part. We have covered the data economy, economic regulation part in the beginning, in the first part. And first of all, we'll have a presentation by Gabriela Rosano from Research ICT Africa, followed by a discussion around these data governance questions. And yeah, we will take questions after the presentation is finalized. You can raise your hand. You're actually invited to do so. And now I can hear the French translator. I can still hear him. Yeah, and we're aiming to conclude the session around 4 p.m. East African time. All right, Gabi, are you ready?
Yes, I think, let me see if I can bounce you off.
I'm trying to stop mine.
I think I bounced you all.
Okay, so everyone can just see Gabi's screen now.
Yeah, the presentation in case you can see it, Gabby, we can't.
No, the presentation is up according to
me.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Gabi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the African Union Commission and GIZ for hosting us today. I'm going to talk a bit to data governance. I'm going to try to stick to time as well. I think one of the more interesting things about the data governance sections, which will be nice for discussions, is the way that, you know, the sort of micro level considerations of data governance inform really nicely macro level data governance as the type that this policy tries to cover. So I look forward to it. Just from the background on the rest of the policy framework, obviously, you know, the entire document runs on and speaks to itself. Well, the intention is that that's what it will be done. But just to take in some like basic salient points in considering, you know, the discrete data governance areas is, you know, that we appreciate the complexity in both data and sector approaches to data and stakeholder approaches to data. That there is, you know, obviously the preconditions are that we discuss in those documents are a very important part of understanding how data policy will in reality be implemented in any kind of domestic context. And we do appreciate that there is a need for considering quite strongly institutional arrangements, which is an area we're still developing a more considered approach on, but we do touch on them in the recommendation. Well, they're called recommendation areas now, but that will later be our policy position areas. So, you know, I think the understanding that nature is heterogeneous, however you want to pronounce it correctly, unlike how I did it, and the idea that data value is linked to the control of data are two quite important ideas that we take through. But I'll turn first to considering or acknowledging the different legal frameworks that we cover, understanding, of course, that policy and law have a relationship. We do discuss the broader policy environment as well as the broader legal environment and some discrete legal considerations across the region. So we consider this is not an exhaustive list of the stuff we're looking at, but we're looking at policies like the EU data strategy and the ASEAN framework, and then also the personal data frameworks. But again, as Alison acknowledged, as Sola acknowledged, you know, we know, of course, that data is not just personal data, and that orientating data policy only to talk to protectionist aspects won't bring us a thriving data economy. We also do address legal coverage, for instance, data protection and competition, cybercrimes, IP, and commercial law. But I think important takeaways from our area on legal and policy frameworks is that, you know, a strong role of data policy is providing legal clarity across the board in what can be quite a diverse area of law and policy that all touches on the data ecosystem. But also, you know, that the constant caution that we must consider regulation with the idea that overly comprehensive regulation may have unintended consequences for the data environment. Now to turn to the different policy, the data policy itself. We proceed discussions, and both Alison and Shamira touched on this, so I won't be touch on it for too long. But, you know, I think the nature of data as a non-rivalrous entity that's also like that's non-excludable, but is partially excludable often through attempts at legal regulation, but perhaps not in reality. So is an important foundational issue in considering data governance. But also one of the more interesting questions we've been thinking of is, and it might sound like a kind of discrete question, but it's actually one of the ones I'm most interested in, is we know that data is heterogeneous, and we know that it's a complex environment given a whole variety of incentives and interests. And so, you know, providing a level of clarity through creating data topologies is useful. And we consider a data topology, for instance, that looks at format, producer, subject, timing, and function. And I'll skip to the slide below, which like provides a kind of table on what that might look like. But I think it's really interesting to think how, in practice, that kind of data topology or understanding of the different types of data and natures of data can actually be constructed in a policy framework to really inform the policymaking productively. And there we go. So that's an example of the table. I'll maybe put it on again later. I mean, there's a lot of detail in there, but these are the kinds of things that we're considering. So to talk to just the specific kind of data policy areas, we've created, obviously, you know, given the nature of data, given the nature of regulation, given the nature of complexity, a lot of these areas are cross-cutting and feed onto themselves. But to bring a kind of conceptual clarity to what we now call the recommendation areas at the moment, we've kind of taken a view of data itself as the subject, rather than a data subject in the personal data sense, but like data itself as the subject of regulation and policy, and tried to consider then the data life cycle to a degree as a way of dividing up some of the issues we think of. And so we start by looking at data quality, which, you know, and all of these areas resonate with the African Union Commission's foundational documents. And, you know, and data quality obviously needs to be understood in terms of the different kinds of data, you know, that data, for instance, is dynamic as well as static. You do find with a lot of data policy and, well, actually more data law, there tends to be an understanding of data as contained in databases or data that is static, which, you know, it doesn't actually reflect the real nature of how data is often used in a cloud environment and in an AI environment and those kinds of things. But within the data quality area, we consider issues around data standards, the role of open data standards in the public sector, for instance, for driving interoperability, although we deal with interoperability later again as well. We consider the agencies that curate public sector data, like statistics agencies. We touch on issues of data literacy and citizen created data and data subjects as well. We then move into an area that we like to call data control. I enjoy the term control because I think it reflects very well on some of those discussions of how you derive value from data. And in the area of data control is where we'll touch on issues of, that it reoccurs in different formats, but for places, but we'll touch on issues of sovereignty and data localization, because those conversations are very interesting in this environment. But also areas of data infrastructure, forms of exerting control over data that are slightly less atypical, like data trust and data stewardships, and those kinds of things. But to touch on localization, as an aspect of data sovereignty, you know, we do address the issue that, of course, there are often, I think there are examples of, there are quite a lot of examples of where, you know, you get forms of sectoral data localization that perform a sound function and don't inhibit the broader data economy necessarily. So I think there are opportunities there in specific considerations, but that, you know, there are a lot more foundational issues in relation to data processing and lawful data processing and personal data processing that should first be in place before that those kinds of considerations actually create a positive impact on the broader data economy, but also that to flag that there are forms of data localization that place economic burdens and also burdens in terms of, you know, in trying to ensure personal data security on local firms more than anyone else. And that's just something to flag in this area. Right. We then move on to data processing. Now, the data processing area that we'll deal with is the only area which is largely restricted to personal data as opposed to data more broadly. And therein we deal with some of the more standard arrangements on data processing. Though I had flagged that in some of the comments that I think we needed to address in data processing, more consideration of sensitive data like children's data and those kinds of things, which I don't think currently is articulated well enough. And then we then move on to data access and interoperability as another vital component of creating this kinds of positive data economy with, you know, local benefits. I mean, in these areas, you obviously get principles like accessibility, openness, but we also discuss the role that data access and interoperability has to play in ensuring data integrity and improving data quality. And it's also under here that we discuss some issues like, again, data standards, data subject rights, but also data partnerships and open government data, and, you know, which are important areas to consider when we start thinking about artificial intelligence and the need for big data and training data sets that can be used to drive local AI. And we also discuss data portability as an area that intersects with competition law. We then move on to data security, which is obviously very relevant given all our foundational discussions on trying to ensure trust as a foundational aspect of a good data economy. And in the area of data security, we talk about issues of transparency and accountability in security, but the role of sovereignty in trying to exercise data security practically. Then we move on to cross-border data flows, which, you know, obviously touches, you know, on the different areas we've discussed all throughout, but will be a particularly important area for considering cross-border institutional arrangements as well as cross-border enforcement. Obviously, localization is a factor under there as well. And we then move on to data demand. And the data demand section was just a section we added to kind of close the loop on this you know, this data life cycle that, you know, in order to have a good data economy, you needed demand, you needed data communities that are enabled in order to make good on the use of this data. And so obviously this is strongly informed by the preceding sections on data economy, which talk about these things in a lot more detail and with a lot more economic clarity. But we just wanted to close the loop here and bring up issues on, you know, the institutional arrangements that can help facilitate these kinds of data communities, you know, touch on some of the innovation community issues that might come up here, link it to the legal frameworks issues on like intellectual property and data protection and compliance burdens and what this means for data communities and how to balance those. As well as issues around regulatory sandboxes, which is obviously very interesting issues that are being explored across the region. Oh, I'm making good on time. And so we then I'll highlight before closing some of the key questions. So these are some of the key questions that came out in relation, some of our key questions, but obviously, you know, I'm more interested in what other people's perspectives are regardless of these questions. But we did some questions on the legal framework in terms of different human rights standards, and as well as considering what the broader environment in the region is and what ways that's, you know, opportunistic and mutually reinforcing, and what ways it detracts. So these are the questions for the legal framework. And then in relation to the broader framework, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I'm quite interested in those questions on how typology can actually inform policy. But we also just want to address broader areas of things like what are we missing, what requires more articulation, and what the areas for real conflict might be if not properly considered. And a more discrete question, which we just flagged because it's of interest, is how we might rationalize or organize the principles, the multiple kinds of principles that come up in this first iteration in a way that's meaningful for policy drafters in a cohesive final document. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabi. The question has been raised. If you could share maybe on your screen again that table that was on the framework itself. It was very early on.
Yes, yes. Can you see my screen now again?
Yeah, we can see the screen.
Okay.
Johannes, we are posting it in the link as well, just so people can go back to it.
Yeah, yeah. I think just for the purpose of maybe a discussion, might be helpful to have a look at that, if possible. I think this one is the one. All right. Thank you. Maybe we can just keep that on for a minute or two, so people can read through it. So thanks again for your presentation, Gabi. Are there any questions? So again, like the primer mode of discussion, I would suggest for participants to raise their hands and open their mics. Alternatively, you can also use the chat. There have been a couple of comments already regarding legal clarity. I see, Suhila, you're raising your hand, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gabriela, for this comprehensive presentation. I have a small question. I would like to know if during this governance framework, we distinguish between personal and the non-personal data, because when we say data governance, we want to address both, because when it comes to personal data protection, like there is also need to facilitate the cross-border personal data to enable certain services. And also there is like a call for within Africa to improve this cooperation between data protection authorities, and also to facilitate cooperation between countries on this. I wonder if it is addressed within this framework, and if it is separated, if we address them both. The governance of data, we address both data, personal and non-personal in same, or we address the personal data within the other section. Thank you.
Should I answer? Okay. No, we definitely do consider personal data and non-personal data. Under the data processing area, that's the only sort of area which deals pretty much solely with personal data. I kind of believe, you know, it makes sense to only place obligations on data processing within the personal data context, although if anybody has another opinion on it, I'm open to it, obviously. But we also, I try between personal data or other types of data, but as like this actually links to this conversation on typologies and how exhaustively you can actually bring up some of these distinctions in a very practical way, although with the bigger issues, you know, the touchstone issues, obviously I've made that clear. And I do think, yeah, that, you know, particularly within the institutional arrangements, we want to consider, you know, building connections between existing data protection authorities and how to drive, you know, the capacitation and effective enforcement from data protection authorities, who obviously have an incredibly important role to play. And we do bring up at several, several discussions about how data protection authorities don't just have a role to play in terms of personal data, but other kinds of data. So for instance, if you look in the South African context, you have a data authority who has oversight of certain privacy rights and certain access to information rights. And obviously data is a component of information, but how that might mean a very interesting role for regulators in driving open government data and open data, and the need actually for an entity to drive particularly issues on open data standards or data standards, even if they're not open data standards. So yeah, I think that deals with those questions.
Thank you, Gabi. We do have 2 raised hands, which I'm very happy about. So I would first give the floor to Diane Woods-Bell. Please quickly introduce yourself and try to be as concise as possible.
Hi, thank you so much, Johannes. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, lovely. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for this convening to both GIZ, RIA, and of course the African Union Commission. My name is Diane Woods-Bell. I'm at the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And so thank you, Johannes, for sharing the information with my colleagues to allow me to be here. I have a few questions, and I wanted to frame them in the context of thinking about the work on digital ID and digital public infrastructure. I'm aware that you had a convening yesterday, which I was unable to attend. Very curious about how the 2 initiatives are connected or not, interconnected or not. And I'm very interested in working on behalf of the Gates Foundation, looking at barriers, breaking down barriers and opportunities for harmonization across Africa, and would love the opportunity to explore this more with everybody who's doing this very impressive work. And I want to share a little bit and open up conversations based on prior experience. So I do want to publicly just share that I spent 14 years at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. So some of my ideas and concepts are coming from there, and I wonder how much you have drawn from the experience of both U.S. and European regulators. I'm wondering about the issues that you framed, but I haven't yet seen addressed. Maybe they're coming up, about competition and innovation, and how those play into the thinking about how you're framing the discussion today. I'm also very curious about the capacity of institutions throughout Africa. You've mentioned capacity building. I think that's really necessary in order to implement any kinds of principles and frameworks. And then I'm really grateful that colleagues have talked about co-jurisdiction across legal entities and institutions, because data privacy authorities, competition authorities, consumer protection authorities, ICT authorities, all the many authorities and ministries, how they work and collaborate and implement is mission critical. And then finally, I know there are too many questions, but I just have so many. And the human rights and other rights, so you mentioned the frame of human rights, and I'm very curious about legal enforcers and human rights, and again, how the 2 intersect, overlap, and work together. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting project and initiative, and I appreciate your comments, thoughts, and feedback.
Thank you, Diane. These were some very good questions, very much on the point as well. So I think we have to split this up. I guess the first part on interconnectedness with different frameworks, like the digital ID framework that's being developed, I think that might be good to answer by Suhaila from AUC, as well as the harmonization efforts on that part. And then I think for competition innovation, how this is approached, I think I'll pass it on to Addison. Suhaila.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Johannes. Thank you for the question, and also thank you for your interest in the work of the African Union Commission. Indeed, there is a need to create complementarity and also connections between all the different policy documents that we are developing. And as it was mentioned, like all of them, they are somehow aligned to the digital transformation strategy, which is the master plan for digital transformation, and also the digital agenda of the continent. But the work is ongoing, and we will work towards achieving this objective, because it is one of our objectives to create this link between all the documents, not only the digital framework, but even the other documents, because also there is a digital e-commerce strategy which is being developed by another department, but we are working in collaboration in order to create synergies between the different frameworks. And to the question to the capacity building, I fully agree with you on the need to really to emphasize on the capacity, because it's kind of the precondition to implement all the policy recommendations. And I think this framework will be followed by the development of action plan, but I think it will be next year, because this year we are very short in time, because we have a deadline to respect, because we target to submit the document for our ministerial meeting, but for sure that the document will be followed by an action plan. And also we are working with other sister organizations like Smart Africa or Data-Cipation to develop with this or to propose this capacity building programs to support this policy document. And also it will be included as one of the priorities within the framework, that we will come up with some policy recommendations to enhance capacities of member states, because when it comes to personal data, we have only almost like 50% of the countries that have already developed their national legislations, while the others, some they are in the process, some they are at early stage. I think there is a need for capacity to member states on this, but I think it will be addressed within this framework as a policy recommendations, but it will be addressed further in the action plan that will be followed next year to support the implementation of this policy framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saida. Alison, do you want to speak to the second part?
Yeah, thank you. And then I'm just going to hand over, if I may, but I just wanted to thank Dion for her input, and just inquire if she was here in the beginning, because we did cover some of these issues in the beginning, and maybe we haven't been explicit enough, because we've assumed some of the stuff we've sort of been working on in the document has come through in the presentation. So
yes,
let
I
me
was there in the beginning,
okay.
But I think you have so much to cover that I just appreciate and respect that. I know you have much more to share, because maybe it was in the little bullet or something. I just did want to confirm in our approach that we have done quite extensive, or certainly comprehensive, mapping of data policy across major regions, North American regions, European and Asian, or ASEAN at least, and limitedly in Latin America, unfortunately, because of our language limitations, but the little bit we've been able to do in English. So we've obviously been drawn on this, a lot of interesting stuff, particularly from Brazil, that we've been able to draw on. So absolutely, our mapping has looked at these other systems. And as I said, what our analysis of this is that they're obviously fundamental and universal kind of aspects to this, and also in relation to competition and to innovation, that require contextualization in our context, in an African context, which in itself is enormously diverse. And that's why we've also emphasized the need for really sort of high level principles that people can then domesticate at what is appropriate for their institutional endowments, human development, etc., etc. But there are these fundamental principles, and we do draw them through. And in relation to your question on human rights, I think we've been I think it is quite clear in the document that this is an important aspect of achieving a whole lot of these positive goals. That in fact, unless you have a commitment to not only privacy in the kind of data protection domination or privacy domination of these discussions, but in relation to other, socio and economic rights as well. That's absolutely critical. So I think we do have a strong rights underpinning of it, but I think also, what we have tried to indicate
is that one cannot talk about digital rights outside of non-digital rights. You know, we can't expect to have digital rights online, can't expect to have rights online if we don't have rights offline. So these kind of, you know, analog preconditions that we need to have are also important to acknowledge, because we simply, without them, we're not going to be able to optimize these incredible benefits that are potentially there. I'm just going to ask Gabby to just fill in on any obvious things that I might have left out.
Sure. I mean, I don't know how much strong coffee I've had, so my memory may fail less, but let me try. It's that balance between having enough to stay awake and not too much that you're a jittery mess. But to touch back on the capacity issue, because I think, you know, the capacity, we talk about capacity, and then actually, similarly to how we're saying, you know, different sectors and different kinds of data need different kinds of treatment, so too, you know, that extends to the capacities. So I have tried to deal in the different recommendation areas with specific nuances of capacities in those different, you know, that might be relevant. So for instance, you'll talk about, you know, in the access section, and security, obviously in security, there's a big capacity question and how to manage that, which actually influences questions around localization and data sovereignty. So I try to touch on that a bit, and I've actually tried to break it down discreetly, but, you know, that's obviously really space we can build on, and because I do know it's coming up repeatedly in discussions, and it's, you know, I'd like to apply my mind a little to it. But on the human rights stuff as well, you know, I think particularly on the development of socioeconomic rights, which the region has been very central in advancing, you know, there is a strong legacy in the region of human rights instruments that are used to inform economic policy very dynamically. And in fact, it's quite a, you know, I think it happens quite naturally, given those kinds of influences. And I think it finds expression in, you know, attempts to balance issues around privacy and access to information that we do in a policy context. But, you know, I think we do try and bring that out, because I do think the region has been very strong in advancing third generation rights. So it's such a great opportunity to at least consistently deliver that message. That's a bit flouncy, but
Dion, was that extensive? Anything left? Did I miss something?
No, thank you very much. I think, you know, this is not, the questions are meant to plant seeds, not to get comprehensive responses, because I appreciate definitely and respect that this is an initial consultation and there's so much work to be done, and looking for opportunities and ways to build bridges with the work that we're also doing at the Gates Foundation, if possible, and just acknowledging that these are very complicated issues. And necessary issues to tackle for growth and transformation in Africa. So thank you very much for all the efforts, and look forward to collaborating.
Thank you for joining. So Catherine has been waiting, Catherine Muya. I would like to pass the mic to you, so to say, so feel free, step forward.
Thank you. Actually, one of the questions, sorry, my name is Catherine Muya from the Lawyers Hub, and we work in Sub-Saharan Africa and do a lot of work on data protection. So my questions, or rather I think our comments, are more or less informed by the work that we've done. And so I agree on the need for data sovereignty, and I think Gabrielle has mentioned the need for building capacity. I just wanted to share some perspectives on what we had when we had the Kenyan data protection regulations, because there are some aspects of the regulations that were calling for data localization and data localization requirements. And I just wanted to share maybe the perspectives that were coming from the private sector in that regard, were that some localization requirements were going to be too expensive to meet. So while I do agree with the policy and what the policy is aiming for, I think that maybe considering some of these considerations in mind might also help improve maybe the implementation framework that we have, or designing the policy as a whole. So maybe, as you say, you have listed out the areas of capacity, we might also want to think what comes before what. So maybe we might think having institutional infrastructural capacity coming alongside capacitating data protection authorities. Maybe that's something you want to consider. And then the second comment that I had that plays into the capacity of data protection authorities is in some of our research, researching from Nigeria or Kenya, one of the problems we found out with data protection was the need for political will. And so when I was looking through the principles of the policy, I didn't really, I get all the, I think, 6 to 7 policies, principles that you have. And when Alison was presenting, she tried to point out the importance of these principles. So I think that maybe recognizing the importance of maybe political commitment or political will, which then plays out to how we resource data protection authorities in Africa, would also be something to consider as a principle. I don't really know how you'd frame it, but it's just something worth considering. So those are my comments. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Looking towards Alison, Gabi, I see your hand, like your actual hand. Please.
So 2000, me to be using my actual hand.
2018.
No, I was just going to say I hear both of Catherine's points, and it's interesting me because it's come out strongly in this meeting, and I hadn't really thought about it. But of course, well, I had thought about it, kind of touched on it in my brain. But it is interesting to think about how you talk about political will and political cooperation and collaboration in a policy framework. Often when I've been, when we think about institutional arrangements and these kinds of things, we talk about regulators, but with the discussion about political actors, domestic political actors and regional political actors in this content isn't really touched on. And when we're talking about, for instance, challenges in getting advancing the Malabo Convention at a rate which is increasing now, but how much of that has to do with political arrangements. It's interesting to think about how we can do that, in a way that's useful in this document.
All right, thank you, Gabi. I think the next person line is Ibrahima Kane.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I joined a little bit late the conversation, so if what I'm saying was already discussed, forgive me. We are talking about securing our data when all the African countries, the data system that we have are built by foreign companies, particularly Chinese companies. Huawei is in many of them building the data centers. What can we do to protect, what this strategy can do to protect our data from being used by foreign companies that are building the system? That's, for me, one of the questions that we need to answer through this process. The second question I really would like to highlight, and somebody alluded to, is the governance of the data system. I think before we even go at the global level, we need to have a system at the level of the continent that govern not only the collection, but the use of data, because we are talking about data that are collected through the data centers, but there are also data that can be collected through drones. The continent is full of drones now. all those information that we are collecting, what governance for all of them when it comes to human rights issues, when it comes to other things. That needs to be, I think, tackled in this kind of policy. And I think at the end of the day, we need to come up with a kind of approach that is accepted by all African countries that will lead to a dialogue at the global level about a better governance of data at the global, because it doesn't exist. The Europeans have their system, the Chinese have their system, the US has its own system. So we will follow the one that is the strongest. We will follow the one that is dominate all of us. So we need also in this process, at least for the African constituency, to come up with a kind of consensus on what needs to be protected or what needs to be done to have our data protected. These are some of the issues that I really wanted to raise, hoping that we will come up with some ideas of solution in this particular process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahima. Well, I think there's no need to follow any other path. I think Africa will certainly path their own. A couple of these questions have been posed earlier and answered. I would pass it to Alison, though, to maybe give to maybe summarize what's been said earlier on, for example, data localization, etc. And yeah, if Suhila or Gabi, if you would like to come in, please also feel free to.
Thanks very much, Johannes, and thank you to Ibrahim for the important questions. As Johannes said, we did cover them before we dealt with the data governance section. And I will just reiterate, although there's really no harm in coming back to it, that these are sort of really critical issues for us to unpack on an evidence base and on a understanding of how data value is created, and how we can agree on those national integrated systems that you speak about, because the whole purpose of this, or a major purpose of this framework, is to provide us with the levels of regulatory harmonization for an integrated market that would provide us with the kind of scope and scale that you need to be an effective, global data player. And as you point out, we certainly, the biggest region, we've got lots and lots of people. There's a lot of potential there, but it's untapped potential. So data's, as we discussed before, data's only, it's an untapped asset. It's only has value once you process it, you transmit it, you do something to it. So when you say, we need to protect our data from those foreign companies, we need to say, what are we losing by foreign companies using that data? And what are the harms? What are the risks? What are we being excluded from? And what are the gains, or are there any gains? And this is a very difficult argument, because basically the unevenness of this relates to many of these really big structural problems that we have in the economy and in our societies that are going to have multi-generational requirements to fix them, or intergenerational requirements to fix them. But I think what we wanted to add is that we have to address the issues of localization. We have to address the issues of sovereignty, because those have potential to create a fairer competitive environment, but only if you actually have the complementary investments to support the development of data. If you're just sitting within data and you're not doing anything with it, then it might be in your citizens' interest actually to allow somebody else to do something with it. We also need to think of the kind of economics of some of these things. So, what is the need to have data locally stored, for example? And that's why the importance that we spoke about different typologies of data. Does all data have to be locally stored? Is it feasible, as is implied in many of the data protection regulations that we draw on and look on, European Union, South African, many across Africa, the idea that if you've got reciprocal conditions in each of those countries, protections, etc. in those countries, that free flow of data is fine. And I make this point because many countries cannot afford, certainly not the kind of data centers that are being built by big tech and even local corporations. They don't have the capacity for that, and even if they did, it is arguably not the best use of their resources. Cloud services, for example, exponentially reduce transaction costs and those kind of things. You only pay for what you use. So if we can actually create the local conditions in order to access those, because at the moment, you can't get the bandwidth's too expensive, the quality's so poor, you get bumped off the cloud, these kinds of things. You can't run a data economy or a data-driven public value, public sector with those kinds of things. So these are really important questions not to address kind of ideologically, which I think because of the extreme unevenness between countries and these data flows, it is a reaction that we have. It's just like, enough. But I think we have to think very strategically about the use of this asset. And one of the ways is creating the scale and scope of the single market. So I think it's really in that context we need to look at it. And maybe that we start with the opening up of data and allowing for the flows and allowing for the integration of the continental data system precisely in these areas. Thank you.
Zahida, would you like to add to this? Zahida, would you like to add to this, or?
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to thank Mr. Khan for his comment and to ensure him that one of the objectives of this framework is to come up with this common approach at continental level on the use of data that is generated by our citizens and also our industry, and see how to make advantage of it. And when we say that, it includes the governance, the enabling of the data flows, and also the management of the data. And we have seen through the presentations that they are taken into account in different ways. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, there is discussions that didn't take place yet at continental level, such as the data sovereignty and the Africa approach on data sovereignty. But I think this framework will give us this opportunity to come up with this common approach at continental level. That's why we invite all stakeholders to provide their input. And as I mentioned, it will be further discussed later on at informal meetings. When it comes to data localizations and data centers, I want just to highlight, as I mentioned earlier, that this point is already taken into account. We do understand that there is a lot to do in this area in order to enable like hosting of data within the continent, and also to creating kind of this data-driven industry. And within the program of infrastructure development in Africa, known as PIDA, recently during the summit, we adopted the project for the second phase from 2021 to 2030. And among the ICT projects, we have 3 data centers for 3 regions. So 3 regional data centers. I think it is big improvement, and I think there is a real interest from FDB to sponsor and to support the development of data centers, because this program will be implemented by 4 organizations: the AUDANIPAD, the AUC, the FDB, and also UNICA. And we are working on this. We do admit that there is a lot to do on this, but it is topics that are already on the table, and it has been discussed during the second phase when we worked to the identification of the new projects for this second phase for PIDA. And I think it is a good progress, but we will further promote this approach within this framework, and hopefully we'll come up with some policy recommendations that will foster the development of data centers across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Zahida. I think the hand by Catherine is an old hand. So Catherine, please. Yeah, all right, it's lowered. There was a question on the chat earlier, and actually before I read it out, I just point out that we are heading towards the end of the allocated time for discussion on data governance, and now are approaching the time for open questions. So we still have roughly a good half an hour left for discussion. So the question by Thompson was, he's curious to know how important the concept of data accuracy was to the framework, considering the main identity documentation challenges in the grassroots of Africa. I guess, Alison, this goes probably towards you.
I mean, I could answer. I think Gabby might be a better person to answer it. I think if you're talking about, when you speak about data accuracy, whether we are referring to it in the context of, data quality or data integrity, this is, a really important issue in developing a good, just to use the language that everyone's using, a good, national integrated data system, whereby at, the different kinds of data, we provide, different mechanisms of governance to do them. So, as I said, at the kind of data collection and processing point of view, one can, allow industries to develop codes of practice for this, ethical practices for this. One can provide, tighter guidelines to ensure people do things, but you also want to, enable innovation there. But the innovation's as good as the data sometimes for these kinds of products that go into it. So, absolutely. And I think, the problem at the moment is that we have such uneven and unequal data. And patchy and inaccurate and bad data, that this really affects all those wonderful things that data can do if it is if it is of a decent quality, and if it has integrity, can do. It's actually not providing the solutions, and it's actually causing harms in certain cases when it's being used for automated decision making that is that a whole group of people aren't visible in or underrepresented. And as a result, discriminated from. It's a really critical question. How you ensure that data quality? Part of that, the market in certain instances will take care, because if you're not presenting the right things, but where we're using it in, if your automations are not delivering the right things, if algorithms aren't delivering the right things, then you can adjust them. But if we're using them, for example, in court systems, we've seen the problems of using that on the previous data that simply builds in all the prejudices of the previous data. So it kind of reviewing the integrity of the data that we're using, and then as I say, building these ethics by design frameworks that would include having good data. If that's the kind of thing you're talking about, we do mention it in the different use of of data. But data quality, is one of the guiding aspects of the document. I just wanted to ask if we could. I think it's very controversial, but I really would like us to get some feedback on this. Johannes, if you wouldn't mind, just in terms of a question. I don't know if there are others. But just related to this, and maybe Gabby can just answer that question as well while she's answering this. But in the presentation, that Gabby's just made, we very much look at data governance in terms of, data control. These data flows, at which points do you need to control them, and what is the rationale for controlling them? And our understanding of data value, or our interpretation, or our argument around it, our informed position, I hope, around data value and the nature of data, argue that this is the way you have to understand it. But if you understand it this way, then data doesn't have a value as an asset that allows it to be owned. And I think this is, one of the big areas of economic contestation, and certainly affects international, intellectual property rights. But if we treat, even if, if you're talking about localization, or we're talking about, sovereignty, these important issues we've been speaking about, or whether you're talking about the data that, a private firm has or the government has, if you treat it as a matter of, you are controlling that data, but that you don't have ownership over it. And I know there are big legal things that other people with much more experience in this can talk about, sort of data sets that have been treated as having intellectual property, etc. behind them. But this is a really important conceptual point to agree on from a policy and regulatory point of view, because it then actually creates opportunities for responsible open data environments. It sets opportunities for accessing private data when one needs to for public interest purposes and these kinds of things. So I think we've kind of glossed over it, and it's such a big issue in data governance that I just wondered if, in answering the other question, when Gabby answered that, you might also like to come back to this. And of course, anybody else, we would really, this is what we'd like to hear on. Thank you.
All right, Gabby, are you ready to take this? So the initial question was around the concept, how much the concept of data accuracy was important to the framework development, given that identity documentation is a challenge. I think this is actually maybe focusing on like personal identity. I'm not quite sure, but yeah. What do you think? You're muted. Classic.
Wow, I'm so in control of this entire conversation, clearly. No, I was going to say that definitely. I think it's, for me, that's a really interesting and important part of the broader data economy, is actually driving the local creation of data that is good data and useful data, precisely because, okay, it depends on the form, but like if you look at statistical forms of data, or other forms of data, particularly when we're starting to try and think about the training of AI and these kinds of things, there's actually a gap in local data. So part of that data economy is driving the supply, but not just from the public sector, although policy would largely concern itself with the imperatives under that part, but also from local different kinds of data communities. So it's an issue that's really close to my heart and really interesting. I think we try and deal with that under the quality of data more broadly, but in terms of personal information, that's dealt with when you consider data integrity as well. So there's just different, maybe different terms for exactly what you're talking about, I hope. And I think they're important conversations because they relate to so much, not just in terms of social outcomes, but also it is an aspect of trying to mitigate against some of the algorithmic bias harms that we look at, only a component of them, but that some of those biases are based on the format and type of data itself is something that we recognize. Although now that you bring it up, I think maybe I need to flag that a little bit more explicitly.
Thank you, Gabby. All right. So we have entered the last half hour of this conversation. We have the opportunity to really raise any kind of question, to hear your input, hear your thoughts, your concerns, your hopes for this data policy framework. I don't see any questions right now in the chat, and also no hands raised. I just give you a minute. Edison, do you have a question?
I actually just am trying to make another swipe at the control and ownership question. I was just wondering if there are any responses, if anybody would like to present an alternative view of that, or whether there's agreement. That's actually not, there's no contest on this, there's no contestation on it. We can just kind of move right ahead. But it is a concept that is used in several other data governance things, and I think there's a movement away from it. But it would be good to hear if there's a feeling that that notion of dealing with data rather in terms of control and ownership is valid. Johannes, if we have no takers there, perhaps just we have Teki Akuta, who's also Falconer, who's also a technical advisor on this project, and just having sat in on yesterday's session, which presented the ID, the digital ID framework in terms of trying to get a trust framework. We've also sort of belabored the point that technical solutions, whether they cybersecurity or data trust solutions, so not technology solutions, but technical solutions or technology solutions, don't necessarily create trust. And what are the things that create trust? Trust is about when your data's not necessarily used as you've been told it's going to be used, or you're not told how it's going to be used, or these kinds of things. So what else do you need? Obviously, cybersecurity, data protection, these kind of technical measures, and even people were suggesting blockchain as distributed ledgers that could kind of address this in a way that people wouldn't be able to interfere with the data, etc. But these technical solutions do not necessarily build trust. They kind of necessary conditions, not sufficient conditions. And maybe Teki, it's something that we haven't really found answers to, but are concerned about this idea that simply sort of technical solutions or security actually deal with issues of trust. I've sort of put her on the spot, so I'm not sure if she's willing to do that. But Teki, perhaps if Johannes would allow you to respond to that, that would be great.
No, I never allowed Teki to speak. I know what happens then. No, please feel free. Yeah, we had a very controversial session yesterday, which I think was very insightful. Teki moderated it. So I think she has a very good overview on the conversation. But is Teki still here? I saw her earlier.
Oh, and she sent me a message earlier. She may have left, sorry.
Wonderful.
Maybe if anybody else has any views on that. Again, it's become very popular language in policy documents, and of course we all want trusted environments, but can we realize them? If we don't, just by calling official bodies trusted parties, does that actually build trust? Because if these systems aren't trusted, they won't work and they won't meet these fabulous objectives that we have.
Hi, this is Juliet Miner. I think thinking about trust and not thinking about it from a technical perspective would be looking at maybe accountability. I think from players or handlers of the data, transparency as well as to how this data is used. And I think this is all things that have been touched on, looking at the user actually having choice and control and redress mechanisms. I think that's also key for building trust. I think there's no technical solution that would be 100% trustworthy without that's enable that ability to engage and go back and forth on any issues arising. So I think thinking about trust, that's what I think of, not necessarily saying that the technology is sound or yeah, and being able to also just have access to what are the processes of an organization when it comes to data handling and very clear data subject rights. I think just throw that in there. Thanks.
Thank you, Juliet.
Can I ask Juliet a question?
Yes.
Maybe I would also allow Jonathan to speak on that. I think he also might want to respond, and then we can keep the discussion going. Even though I would like to not to go too much into digital ID.
Go into the trust.
Well, Johannes, thanks, and thanks to Alison. I'm Jonathan Maskell from the World Bank. I'm not going to talk about ID, Johannes. So we had enough of that yesterday, and that will continue. But regarding this issue of trust, I think obviously technology is binary, ones and zeros, right? And trust is certainly a very dynamic thing, depending on how you interpret it. And as has been mentioned, it depends on many factors: political, social, economic, legal, technical, and many other things. But what so anyone who wants to trust something or a trust framework, it's all based on relative and dynamic terms. And what frameworks hopefully can facilitate is enabling participants, whether it's in a transaction or in a framework, to analyze, for example, the risks and factors so that they can determine either on a systematic or on a transactional basis whether the other party or the data or whatever it might be is trusted, right? Because it's so dynamic, because it's so imperfect, there's never going to be perfect trust. So I think a framework helps in organizing and helping the what's called often a risk-based approach. Right? You may more easily trust data from one country or one system compared to another. And for the one that you don't trust as much, you can have additional processes perhaps to determine if you might want to trust that instead, rather than assuming like for country A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Sohila, I saw you unmuted yourself. Did you also want to speak on that?
Thank you. I think on this question of this trust environment, maybe we can ask the question differently, maybe to say what are the requirements to create trusted environment and what needs to be done to achieve this trusted environment. But this what I wanted to add on this, but I wanted just to bring to your attention that we have some questions in the chat that we didn't answer. I think we need to address them as well. I think maybe we can take them after we finish with this question. Thank you.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw one question there. But yeah, that's finished. I think, Alison, you wanted to ask actually a question towards Juliet regarding the trust. You're muted. Alison, I think you're still muted.
Sorry, Johannes and Juliet, I suppose I was just kind of trying to push the discussion beyond the principles of, accountability, transparency, user choice. Obviously, these are all things that enhance trust. And, the thing is, what happens when people feel that they're there, but they're not used? And I think this just really goes to, a lot of the literature, a lot of the popular stuff on, the trust challenges that institutions are facing, that countries are facing, that governments are facing, that media are facing. And a lot of it is because of this, data, this information and things that people don't have control of. So I suppose there's a kind of technical trust issue, which Martin was just referring to. But then there's, I suppose, these kind of softer aspects of trust that make you trust the political system, that make you trust that, that data that's you're giving in your bio ID system or whatever it is going to be used to only for that purpose, only to use that services, etc. So it was just really, I was just trying to deal with this nugget that this problem that we sort of got in trying to operationalize this actually very sort of values-based things? Does it help if you've got a strong human rights environment, or strong common values, at least, not even human rights, but strong common values in whatever ecosystem you're talking about? But I think Jonathan's addressed some of the technical things, and of course we can include those, and we must include those. But are there kind of sufficient conditions for trust? And I think the risk assessment thing is an important part, but then there's certain where you really need trust is where you don't have all the information. I mean, I think that's the kind of work on data trusts and these kinds of things are looking at, where you can actually give your consent to somebody else who might be in a better position to make the decision collectively, and these kinds of things are trying to exactly grapple with that. But thank you. That's interesting.
So I'm not sure when I get a chance, but just to apologize, I had a problem with my microphone and I want to see if it's working now.
It does, yeah. All right. There's been a question on the chat now for a while regarding shouldn't African civil society be involved in the development of the framework? Sahila, would you like to respond to this question?
Sorry, which question? Is the one related?
There's a question from the chat coming. Shouldn't African civil society be involved in the development of the framework?
Yes, I think the civil society is welcome to participate in this framework, because we have seen that this framework addresses both the economic, the governance, and also the human aspect. We have seen the part related to the human rights, and also the part related to personal data protection, to privacy, and I think the participation of civil society is important, and it is the reason why we created this online consultation, like to enable civil society, private sector, and academia, and other stakeholders to have access to this document and provide their views at early stage, that we can take them into account. And also within the African Union Commission, we have a department dealing specifically with the civil society, and they are member of the task force, so they also express the views of the civil society as a department, and also they may rely on their partners maybe to get input if they wish. But for us, we rely on the department as a member of the task force to highlight the concerns and the interests of the civil society. But as we mentioned, the objective is to come up with a comprehensive document, and we try to create this inclusive and participatory process that to facilitate the participation and open to all views and comments. It is what I can say for this moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahila. There are two raised hands, one by Gabriela and then one by Nanjala. So I'm going to take one after the other. Yeah.
I know. I am anyway. I just wanted to address Juliet's comment again, because it does make me think. I completely agree, and we touch on issues of accountability and recourse in different sections, not just in terms of personal data, but in other data contexts as well. But it does make me think about how in our conversations of trust and our conversations of data ecosystems, as well as necessary preconditions and overlapping issues, there's a need to address in this trust environment how we acknowledge other instruments of good governance, the policies and standards and instruments on good governance in different countries that should be facilitating a broader trust environment, not just in terms of the data economy. I'm thinking, for instance, administrative justice principles and those kinds of traditional good governance mechanisms that at least form a part of the broader trust conversation and should be acknowledged and tied more neatly. So just to let you know, Juliet, that I'm I'll think about how to do that concretely.
Thank you, Gabi. Manjala, happy to see familiar faces from yesterday.
Yeah, I hope you can hear me. I had some trouble with my audio yesterday.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring something up in relation to this trust question, but just in relation to the question of civil society, the trust question, and I guess in general with the processes that we're building into this policy framework and the ideas that we're embedding into the policy framework. And I'm going to speak very frankly because I'm not one for keeping my ideas in abstraction or in policies speak. I think it's important for us to be as frank and as direct with some of these issues as possible, because it is life or death. I mean, I look at what happened in India with their digital ID process, and I look at what happened in Bulgaria with their tax records being hacked and things like that. And I think to myself, this is a life or death issue. And so remaining in the realm of abstraction for the sake of producing a document and meeting deadlines, I think we do ourselves a disservice. So allow me to speak a bit frankly right now. I think the thing with the trust question is this. Are we in conversation with the people whose data will be implicated in all of these policies? Or are we simply in conversations with the states that will administer the policies? And I understand that the AUC and is primarily a state-facing mechanism, and we're developing these documents to guide state decision-making. But we have to be frank about the fact that for many African people, the state is the biggest obstacle to the realization of their digital rights. That it's the state that stands in the way of them trusting some of these institutions. That it is the state that is, purveyor of misinformation. That the state that is that is the threat that needs to be restrained. And so, a very easy way to build in trust in bureaucratic systems, in political systems, and by extension in digital systems is, one, are we creating avenues for states to constrain themselves? And someone talked about this yesterday in light of, the African Court of Peoples and Human Rights. We have to think along the lines of create the digital, whatever energy it finds in the public sphere that it comes in contact with, it will be an intensifier. And if we're dealing with states that have demonstrated a pattern of not being willing to constrain themselves, then creating digital policies, data policies that are not in conversation with the people and bringing the people into, even as someone has pointed out, at the very basic level, at the consultative process, what we're doing is we're putting all the cards in the hands of a government, and that is the risk that is a risk, for citizens. Practical example, exactly what happened with the Huduma number in Kenya, the digital ID in Kenya, 2019, that came in without a data protection law. Even though the Constitution, Article 31, has provisions for data privacy, there was no regulatory framework for privacy as legislative, like this is what happens when your privacy is violated. In the 2009 census and the 2019 census, which was done in August, between March and August, when the Huduma Number project was launched under a great hail of threats, I might add, there was a lot of resistance because people don't like being threatened and people don't like being denied access to key services. And what happened was, instead of respecting the antipathy of the public and instead of working with the public to bring them into the process, not only did they intensify the threats, but then the census process in 2019, the threat was, we will make it mandatory for anybody who responds to a census form to tell us their Huduma number and to hand over their GPS coordinates without a data protection or a data privacy framework to constrain how that information will be used and shared between departments. This is the energy that a lot of us are having to deal with on a grassroots level as civil society, as individuals. And so when we talk about some of these policies in an abstract sense, I get frustrated as a citizen, as a taxpayer in an African country, and as a person who works in the digital rights space, because then I ask myself, where is the citizen in all of these conversations? We're talking about enhancing the consultative process. It's not just about civil society, right? I happen to have time to be on this call. I heard about this a meeting from a person or a friend of a friend who was tweeting about it, but the outreach has to be more sincere. And the engagement has to be more sincere because, as I said in the beginning, these things become life or death. For Somali people who have been denied IDs in Kenya since 1963, digital ID is life or death. For Nubian people who are not allowed to get birth certificates and death certificates and have to bury their loved ones, you know, underneath their homes because they can't access cemeteries in Kenya, it is a life or death issue. For people who are living on HIV/AIDS, getting grants from the government whose data is handed over to foreign governments who are reliant on ARVs, it's a life or death issue. And so so I just want to emphasize that the consultation process that we're asking for bringing civil society in, for bringing in the dialogue from the people, it cannot be superficial. It cannot be a question of, let's check a couple of boxes. And it will address this question of trust that you're putting on the table, because there's a reason why we don't trust our governments. There's a pattern and a history that we're responding to and that we're trying to navigate. Thank you.
Thank you, Nanjala. I think Andrew raised his hand to respond to this.
Yes, I did, and I've tried to share my screen. I don't know if it's visible to you all.
But Andrew is also from Research ICT Africa.
Yes, sorry, I should mention that I'm from Research ICT Africa. And so I wanted to emphasize that, as Alison mentioned earlier, we have emphasized already in the draft framework, and to emphasize once again, it's very much a draft, that trust is essential. So I think this intervention is particularly useful because we've emphasized that trustworthy data systems are not simply those that are technically secure, although they have to be technically secure, and not simply those in which there's a good regulatory framework and enforcement of personal data protection, although that's also an essential. But they require the rule of law, and they require trust in bigger institutions, not just regulators, but larger government systems. But I want to also emphasize that what trust gives you, trustworthy systems give, is the opportunity to take a greater part and a more efficient part and to garner more benefits for your country. So I think while it's important to say we hold governments to account, we'll also see that governments have a very strong incentive to be trustworthy, because without trustworthy data systems, those benefits will not accrue to their countries, and certainly will not accrue to businesses based in those countries, and will not accrue to the citizens of those countries. And so this is trustworthy. Trust isn't just something that citizens should demand of their governments, but it's something that is required for a workable data system. So I'd like to say, while I understand and emphasize with the concern about trust, actually there are very strong and powerful, important incentives for all players to help create trustworthy systems. And so, and there are incredible opportunities to benefit from trustworthy systems, including those governments which may have to earn or win trust for the future. They have strong incentives if they want to take part in the benefits of a data economy to be trustworthy. And so I think our emphasis is that trust is necessary, but also that it's actually has huge economic and social advantages. And so there are strong incentives for everyone to build trustworthy systems together. And in fact, no government or corporation can build a trustworthy system on its own. This is in fact a collaborative exercise. I think I've covered that. I want to reassure everyone that I had taken down a lot of your earlier questions. We don't have time to cover those right now, so I'm going to hand back to Johannes in a minute. But I have actually created 5 slides of questions that I've captured. Can't guarantee every single one of those questions will get into the draft as a question. Some of them may end up as comments, but although we don't have time for it, I was going to give you the feedback that we've captured during the course of today, and I'm very grateful for that feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. So I know we are heading towards the end of the session. I would like to give Linda Bonio the opportunity to speak or to ask a question. But after that, I'll close it and hand over to Sahida for some closing remarks. So Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Linda Bonio from Kenya, the Lawyers Hub in Kenya. I'd want to just make two comments and really build up from what Nanjala has said. And my first request, if this could be noted, is there a possibility to have a longer consultation period? And I'd say this, my second comment will be that we need time, we need buy-in, and you know, Nanjala has mentioned really focusing on governments and consulting governments, I think is a great idea. But the truth is, it's the general public that their data will be handled. I personally work in the space, and it's really surprising to get these invitations from the US to attend something that concerns the continent. It's annoying that those who work in the space are actually not directly, you know, invited to these spaces, yet this is our continent. I would want to directly request that you at least extend time for stakeholders to be able to connect with their communities and get these discussions going with them, that will be able to bring in feedback, not from individual levels, but from our communities. I think that would be really important. We work with lawyers across the continent. We just had a conference. We had no idea, no formal invitations on what was happening. We would have contributed to these discussions. And so I just want to ask for those who invite people into the room, let's expand those networks and not just look for this echo chamber of people who look like us, but, you know, citizens who could be engaged in this particular process. Yeah, so I'd be really happy to hear about any, you know, any exemptions towards this deadline on the submissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I think that maybe Alison can give a very brief answer to that. Maybe just one remark from my side. So for the online consultation process, this has been extended until Monday only. However, this is, I think, everything we can do at this point. There is the opportunity to continue to input online on Research ICT Africa's website. Alison, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say that you know, I think I can speak for all of us, completely acknowledge the inadequacies of the online consultation and of the public consultation. I think there's a very pragmatic decision, and it might be compromising, as you've indicated, in that we had this window of opportunity. This time frame had been set by the digital transformation strategy and had to come before the ministers' meeting, and there's a possibility of losing this window or delaying this window, and then these very high-level principles don't, you know, go forward. Obviously, we've got all the issues people have spoken about if they actually, you know, great high-level principles, and like the Malabo Convention, they're not ratified, all these kinds of things. But this is really just a framework for people to use and to get as much kind of positive input into it. Of course, a proper consultation, you know, a lengthy consultation and getting citizen participation and feedback would be the first prize. You know, it wasn't in this timeline, and it's not been an option. Extending the deadline to Monday is really just trying to get people's input as early on in the drafting and task force process, because obviously, you know, at a certain point it gets quite baked, and so it's difficult to unbake. If there's anything that you kind of really feel is not capturing things, I know this doesn't address the issue of citizen consultation, and there's no way you're going to be able to do that meaningfully before Monday. But if there's anything from your experience that you feel, you know, particular concerns about, that you feel from your other work you can bring, you know, citizen concerns to this process, you know, please do, because that actually is an important part of the consultation. You know, the responses to Nanjala, the responses to Linda by saying, you know, yes, there are, you know, rational incentives, the economic incentives, but that assumes a kind of rationality in policymaking and in politics. And that has, you know, Nanjala's points have shown are not always there. But we can't actually, you know, construct the policy on, on that basis, on the regard. But it does make us realize that we can't just sort of, claim that, governments and trusted environments are going to make sure this happens. We're going to have to say, under the best conditions, or, this is what is actually required if you're going to get that. And if you don't do this, you're not going to get that. So I just wanted to acknowledge the complete, and we've had this discussion, within the AU and with GIZ, the complete inadequacy of this process. We have pushed for this very limited process, and AUC and GIZ have been very accommodating of our efforts to push out this, the kind of start date proper until we've had this. And I completely acknowledge the inadequacy, but I would urge you to support the pragmatism. I hope it's not too expedient, and bring those experiences to the process. But thank you very much for your inputs. They are completely acknowledged.
Thank you very much, Alison. So now we're already 5 minutes over time. So I would like to thank everyone from my side for joining today, for all your comments and questions. And I'd like to pass the final word actually to Sohila for some closing remarks from the African Union's Commission side. And yeah, we'll already say thank you from my side at this point, and thanks for joining. And I hope you stay with us later for the process.
Thank you, Johannes. Thank you for all the participants for their interest in this AUC project, and also for their comments that we try to take them into account within the finalization of this framework. We do understand also all the concerns raised by the participants, and also the questions arise. We try to see how we address as much as we can. As we mentioned in the beginning, that the objective of this data policy framework is to come up with a common approach, like at continental level, on data, how to use data in an efficient and effective way to harness its potential, and also to unlock its transformative potential, to foster innovation, enable digital trade across the continent, address some development challenges, and also the ultimate goal is to provide new opportunities and also improve lives of people. And as I mentioned, the objective is to address this data policy from different perspectives, and also we have, as it was mentioned by my colleague from the African Union, we really try to focus on the economic aspect of the data, how to make advantage of this asset to enable African countries to participate in the ever-changing landscape and also digital economy across the world, and also come up with a common policy on how to build and to develop data-driven economies and societies. And I think, as it was mentioned by Johannes and also Alison, we will open the document until the 2nd of August for additional inputs and comments. And as I mentioned, for the civil society, we will try to work in close collaboration with our Department of Civil Society and we try to, if you can channel your comments or your inputs through these departments, it will enable us to further take them into account, because now we will move to the work of the task force, and they invite all members of the task force to further work with us to finalize this document, because as we mentioned, we try to involve all the regional organizations in order to come up with something that reflect the views and interests of each parts. And I invite also the experts from member states to participate in the discussion during the validation workshop that will take place in early September. It is, as you mentioned, it is the beginning. There is many things to improve. There is maybe things that need more discussions, but I think we need to start somewhere, because the data is a very, very important topic, and we need to address it. And from our side as a continental organization, our role is to coordinate between different actors and facilitate the discussions, and we try to bring on board all the concerned parties, and we hope to come up with something that will respond to the needs of all parties and will safeguard African citizens' rights and also enable our countries to move towards this effective use of data to support our development. I thank you all for your participation. I invite you to provide your comments in the documents and also to share with your colleagues if they are not aware about this initiative, and we welcome all the comments and inputs. Thank you all for your participation, and I wish you a good day. Thank you.